Chapter 22, Pen Friends. A new kind of man has come to his bliss. To end the Cold War, he has borne against his own kind flesh. Allen Ginsberg, Who Be Kind To. The year 1964 was a bad one for Cold Warriors. The myths upon which they relied were being systematically exploded. First, there was the publication of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, written in 5 months by a junior diplomat in the British Embassy in Bonn using the nom de plume John le Carré. It sold 230,000 copies in America and a further 2 million more in paperback in 1965, when Paramount released its film version. Le Carré traced the novel's origins to his own great and abiding bitterness about the East-West ideological deadlock. Richard Helms, who was then in charge of CIA undercover operations, detested it. Le Carré was now ranked alongside Graham Greene, whose 1955 novel The Quiet American had appalled America's clandestine community, as authors the agency liked to hate. They were dupes, said Frank Wisner, ill-wishing and grudge-bearing types. This was followed by Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, which satirized the madness of Cold War ideology. In a letter published in the New York Times, Lewis Mumford called it the first break in the catatonic Cold War trance that has so long held our country in its rigid grip. What is sick is our supposedly moral democratic country, which allowed this policy to be formulated and implemented without even the pretense of public debate. First then, on the 18th of September 1964, America's single most influential Cold Warrior, C.D. Jackson, died in a New York hospital. Days before, Eisenhower had flown down from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to see the critically ill C.D. The Boston Symphony Orchestra, which owed its global reputation largely to C.D.'s support, held a memorial concert for him, with the soloists Vitya Vronsky and Victor Bobbin playing Mozart. Later, the orchestra's summer school, Tanglewood, set up the C.D. Jackson Master Awards and prizes in his memory. Sponsoring the prize were many alumni of that special school of Cold Warriorism over which C.D. had presided. By 1964, these people were already walking anachronisms, members of a diminishing sect whose demise, though by no means complete, seemed ensured by a wave of revulsion and protest against the values they represented. They were like so many wiffle birds, the name one New York intellectual invented for a fabulous creature that flies backwards in ever-decreasing circles until it flies up its own asshole and becomes extinct. With the rise of the New Left and the Beats, the cultural outlaws who had existed on the margins of American society now entered the mainstream, bringing with them a contempt for what William Burroughs called a sniveling, mealy-mouthed tyranny of bureaucrats, social workers, psychiatrists, and union officials. 3. Joseph Heller in Catch-22 suggested that what America deemed sanity was actually madness. Allen Ginsberg, who in his 1956 lament Howl had mourned the wasted years, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, now advocated the joys of the cultural Cold War. 226 open homosexuality and hallucinogenic peyote solitudes. Munching LSD, singing the body electric, reading poetry in the nude, navigating the world through a mist of benzodrine and dope. The Beats reclaimed Walt Whitman from stiffs like Norman Pearson Holmes and sanctified him as the original hippie. They were scruffy rebels who sought to return chaos to order, in contrast to the obsession with formulae which characterized magazines like Encounter. Exasperated by these developments, Sidney Hook wrote to Josselson on 20th of April 1964. In Europe, they have a theater of the absurd, and in existentialism, a philosophy of the absurd. In the U.S., the latest development among intellectuals is a politics of the absurd, whose slogans are down with U.S., America stinks, long live sex, etc. It is really very amusing. Mailer, Podhoretz, etc. And they have a new and fervent disciple, Mr. Jack Thompson, whose discretion, I fear, is no better than his intelligence. For Thompson had discretion enough to realize that it was the better part of valor and stayed on as executive director of the Farfield. 1964 also marked the first birthday of the New York Review of Books. Guided by Jason Epstein and Robert Silvers, the review's instant success clearly signaled that not all American intellectuals were happy to act as Cold War legitimists orbiting around the national security state. As the ruling consensus began to fragment, the review signaled the emergence of a newly critical intelligentsia. free to speak on those issues on which magazines like Encounter, bound, as it was, to a consensual discipline, were virtually mute. If the impression had been given that all New York intellectuals had, by some kind of reverse alchemy, transformed themselves from bright radicals to become just another base metal of the CIA arid the rest of the Cold War establishment, here was evidence to the contrary. Far from being apologists for American power, these were thinkers who rallied to the Review's readiness to denounce imperialism just as it denounced communism. And to the horror of the CIA, it became the flagship for intellectual opposition to the Vietnam War. We had a big problem with the yin and yang of the New York Review crowd, especially when it got so anti-Vietnam and so left-wing, Five remembered Lee Williams, who was less than forthcoming about what measures were taken to counteract the Review, limiting himself to saying that it wasn't a punch, counterpunch situation. Six Michael Josselson himself was not impervious to the new spirit. Although he took pains to conceal his growing disillusionment with the American proposition, privately he conceded that he was appalled by the shape it had assumed. Years later, he was to write that the experience of working with and for the outfit had become truly traumatic. In the 1950s, our motivation was buttressed by America's historic promises. In the second half of the 1960s, our individual values and ideals had been eroded by our intervention in Vietnam and by other senseless U.S. policies. 7. The claimed missile gap, the doomed U-2 flights, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all these imperial blunders had undermined Josselson's faith in the American century and in the government agencies which were charged with realizing it. Even Harry Truman, whose administration had founded the CIA in 1947, said he now said something about the way the CIA has been functioning that is casting a shadow over historic positions, and I feel that we need to correct it. 8. In an era which was beginning to embrace the idea of détente, Josselson now looked to move the Congress away from the habits of Cold War apartheid and towards a dialogue with the East. Through its relationship with Penn, the Congress was ideally poised to do just that. By the mid-1960s, International Penn had 76 centers in 55 countries and was officially recognized by UNESCO as the organization most representative of all the Rip Penn Friends' 227 Ers of the world. Its task, fixed by statute, included a promise to avoid, in all circumstances, engagement in state or party politics. It was this refusal to succumb to bias or party prise, coupled with a robust defense of freedom of expression, which guaranteed the worldwide expansion of Penn during the Cold War years. But the truth is that the CIA made every effort to turn Penn into a vehicle for American government interests, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom was the designated tool. The Congress had long taken an interest in Penn, despite Arthur Koestler's peroration that it was run by a bunch of arseholes who worried that the campaign for cultural freedom meant fanning the Cold War. 9. Initially, the Congress's efforts had been directed at keeping Eastern Bloc delegates out of Penn, fearing that the communists would attempt to infiltrate the organization and influence its debates. We are prepared to talk to Russian writers, Russian artists, Russian scientists. Nabokov had written to Richard Crossman in 1956, but we do not want to meet and talk to Soviet bureaucrats or Soviet officials in their stead. Unfortunately, we are much too often confronted with precisely that type of subservient and police-minded Soviet bureaucrat. Stony look, square shoulders, blue serge suit, and baggy pants, whom we want to avoid. 10. Rightly concerned to keep these imposters out, the Congress had liaised successfully with Penn's secretary, David Carver. When news reached Josselson in 1956 that the Communists planned to make a big push at the PN Conference in Japan the next year, he easily persuaded Carver that the Congress's top battery, listed as Salone, Koestler, Spender, Milosh, etc., should be brought out in opposition. John Hunt, himself a member of International Penn, he had joined in 1956 after publishing his first novel, Generations of Men, had a friendly relationship with David Carver, who acted as an unofficial agent for Encounter, distributing copies of the magazine at Penn meetings. In 1964, Hunt decided that Carver was overworked and needed help. So the Congress offered to provide help in the person of Keith Botsford, who had kicked his heels in South America for a while after the Lowell fiasco, before returning to the U.S. to become co-editor with Saul Bellow of the literary magazine The Noble Savage. Now, once again, he was conveniently on hand to help his friend Hunt, and duly appeared at the offices of International Pen in London in autumn 1964. It never occurred to me to wonder why Botsford suddenly turned up the way he did, said a Pen activist. But now I think of it, it was a bit odd. The French section of Pen was infuriated to learn of Botsford's appointment and wrote angrily to Carver to demand an explanation. Defending the appointment, Carver said that he had been working with Botsford for some time in terms of complete harmony and close cooperation. His position is quite simple and uncomplicated. The English Executive Committee has appointed him my assistant and deputy, and as I combine the offices of General Secretary of the English Center and International Secretary, it follows that I naturally expect him to help me over the whole range of my work. 12. The French had good reason to be worried. Suspicions about the nature of Botsford's links to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and about that organization's links, in turn, to the U.S. government, made them fear that the Americans were attempting to take over Penn. They were right. It was Keith Botsford who telephoned Arthur Miller in 1965 and said he wanted to come and see him with David Carver. Miller, who was in Paris at the time, knew Botsford vaguely from The Noble Savage, to which he had contributed 2 short stories. Now he was saying something about Penn, of which I had only vaguely heard, recalled Miller. The next day, Botsford arrived in Paris with David Carver, who invited Miller to become the next Presi, the Cultural Cold War 228 dent of international Penn. The point now was that they had come to the end of the string, Miller later wrote. The recent détente policy called for new attempts to tolerate East-West differences, which PN had not yet gained the experience to do. A fresh start was needed now, and it was me. 13, but said Miller, I had a suspicion of being used and wondered suddenly whether our State Department or CIA or equivalent British hands might be stirring this particular stew. I decided to flush them out. Penn stood stuck in the concrete of what I would soon learn were its traditional Cold War anti-Soviet positions, but like the Western governments at this point, it was now trying to bend and acknowledge Eastern Europe as a stable group of societies whose writers might well be permitted new contacts with the West. Miller told one historian that it passed through my mind that the government might have wanted me to become president of Penn because they couldn't otherwise penetrate the Soviet Union, and they figured that traveling behind me could be their own people. They wouldn't expect me to do it, I don't think. One of the early people who approached me about Penn, I can't remember his name now, but people later would say about him, why, that guy was an agent all the time. Now I have no evidence of that. It was gossip. 14, the Americans wanted an American president of Penn, and they were about to get one. Carver had in fact been going all out to get John Steinbeck, winner of the 1962 Nobel Prize for Literature, but he never materialized, and Miller was the second choice. For the French, neither candidate was suitable. They wanted at all costs to keep the Americans out. As soon as they learned of Carver's intentions to find an American candidate, French Penn put forward one of their own in the person of Miguel Ángel Asturias, the great Latin American novelist, and a member of Penn's French Center. Josselson referred to him in disgusted tones as that old Nicaraguan fellow traveling warhorse Asturias, 15, and wrote in urgent tones to Manes Sperber, who was then living in Paris, urging him to appeal to André Malraux, de Gaulle's Minister of Culture and a longtime friend of the Congress, to block the Asturias candidacy. Sperber was hesitant, writing back that the Ministry of Culture had nothing to do with Penn, an independent organization. But Josselson insisted, telling Sperber that nothing less than French prestige was at stake, and as such, the government would surely take an interest. If Asturias was elected, Josselson claimed, it would be a catastrophe, as it would signal the end of our friend Carver. 16 Carver, with full backing from his American friends, continued to pursue his own candidate, writing an 8-page open letter to Penn members in April 1965, challenging the legitimacy of the French candidacy, accusing the French center of falsifying the facts and dismissing Asturias as a man who lacked every qualification needed for the job of the international presidency. After receiving a copy of Carver's letter, veteran Cold Warrior Louis Galantier, a member of the executive board of American Pen, warned his conferers that the French offensive is designed not only to thwart the election of an American international president, but also to capture the international secretariat. I consider the French move to be one more example of the overweening hubris that has seized French officialdom, for I do not doubt that this has the approval of the Quai d'Orsay. 17. Members of the executive board of the American Center included several friends of the Congress, other than Galantier. One member in particular stands out on the letterhead, Roby Macaulay. With Macaulay, the CIA had a man with executive power in American Pen. This meant that when Cordmeyer decided to send him to London as the IOD's case officer for Penn, his interests in its activities there would appear to be perfectly natural. Nonetheless, to Penn Friends 229 make sure his cover was tight, Macaulay was a Guggenheim Fellow and then a Fulbright Research Fellow for the 2 years he was in England. With Botsford and Macaulay in London, and Carver a recipient of Congress funds, and more directly of Farfield funds, the CIA had achieved excellent penetration of Penn. In the midst of the battle over the presidency, Carver and Botsford forged ahead with plans for the next big Penn Congress, scheduled to take place at Bled in Yugoslavia in the first week of July 1965. John Hunt agreed to fund a group of writers to attend the meeting, and Kenneth Donaldson, the CIA's London-based Comptroller General, was instructed to organize payment to Penn out of the Congress's account. The list of proposed delegates was compiled by John Hunt with the strict proviso that if any of these individuals cannot go, the Penn Club Secretariat must have the approval of the Congress in Paris to use the funds to send someone else. 18 Hunt's list included David Rousset, Helmut Jesrick, Lasky's successor as editor of Der Monat, Max Hayward, Spender, Chiaramonte, and Ceylon. Under a separate grant from the Farfield Foundation, travel expenses were provided for Carlos Fuentes and Wole Soyinka. 19. Together with the other delegates, they elected Arthur Miller as Penn's new president. Having scored a victory at the Bled Congress, John Hunt started preparing for the next Penn conclave, due to take place in New York the following June. This would be the first time in 42 years that the American Center had played host to an international Penn Congress. With the stakes this high, the CIA decided to bring out the full battery of its covert arsenal. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, for one, was to play a significant role. It had already given £1,000 to Carver in June 1965 to start organizing the New York campaign, which was fine-tuned over lunch with Hunt at the Chanterelle restaurant on Brompton Road. The Ford Foundation made a timely intervention, awarding American Pen a substantial grant, $75,000. In January 1966, and the Rockefeller Foundation coughed up an additional $25,000. The CIA also channeled money to American Pen through the Asia Foundation and the Free Europe Committee. With such investments at stake, John Hunt wrote to David Carver on 9th of February 1966, telling him that he thought it wise to try and limit their liability. 20. Hunt's proposed insurance was to place the Congress for Cultural Freedom seminar organizer, Marion Bieber, either in Carver's office or in New York for 3 weeks prior to and during the conference itself, at the Congress's expense. The multilingual Bieber, who was working for the Institute of Contemporary History in London, was a veteran of such campaigns from her work in the 1950s as Deputy Executive Secretary of the Congress. With such a top-flight person placed in the heart of English or American Pen, Hunt could be assured that his interests would be protected. At the same time, Hunt wrote to Louis Galantier, now president of American Pen, to make a similar offer. Who better than Roby Macaulay, recently returned to Washington, whose cover as editor of the prestigious Kenyon Review meant that he was above suspicion? Macaulay was subsequently placed at the disposal of American Pen as a kind of fixer factotum, 21. Additionally, Hunt agreed to pay travel expenses for prominent Western intellectuals, of his choice, to attend the Congress. The 34th International Pen Congress took place between 12 to 18 June 1966. Its organizers, both overt and covert, congratulated themselves that the prestige of hosting the event meant that a blot on the U.S. record was thereby removed. A report of the conference described euphorically how the preeminence of the U.S. as the pace setter of contemporary the cultural Cold War 230 civilization was triumphantly confirmed by the fact that the Congress took place in New York City. Organized around the theme of the writer as independent spirit, the concentration on the writer's role in society and his concerns as artist was something which redounded to the credit of our country. 22. But not all observers came to the same conclusion. In a lecture delivered at New York University on the eve of the Penn Conference, Connor Cruz O'Brien took a heavy sideswipe at the idea of intellectual independence. The Dr. Jekyll of the Congress's general theme, the writer as independent spirit, is in danger of turning into Mr. Hyde, the writer as public figure, he said. Whereas writers in the past could be accused of being strangers to political passions, Julian Benda, now they were liable to be distracted or debauched by them. 23 O'Brien went on to summarize a recent article in Encounter, in which Dennis Brogan had praised the magazine for its struggle against la trahison des clercs, the phrase Benda had used to attack writers of talent who made themselves spokesmen and propagandists for political causes. This, of a magazine which was so congenial to the prevailing power structures, struck O'Brien as misleading. Far from being politically quietist, O'Brien found that Encounter had consistently followed a political line, a key element of which was the inculcation of uniformly favorable attitudes in Britain towards American policies and practices. 24. The New York Times reported O'Brien's claims, which hung over the Penn meeting and signaled the beginning of the end of the Congress for Cultural Freedom.